Following on from the definition of political risk, this lesson looks at a different way to look at political risk and a different way to interpret it. So as we saw previously, risks can be broken down, or political risk can be broken down into two categories. The macro risk, which affects the whole country, or a micro risk, which is a risk for a particular sector rather than all firms operating in that country. However, you can also break it down into two different time horizons, such as short-term risk and long-term risk. And this helps us differentiate between the more immediate risk and those which are longer term and structural in nature. And the importance of that is because they will have different impacts on the economy. So for example, although each risk model is different, the point to bear in mind is that short-term risks are those that can have an immediate impact on the political or economic environment, as well as the policy-making process. So for example, I would consider these types of risks below as short-term. A spike in inflation, this could lead to protests and demonstration. Let's say people are quite poor already and inflation starts rising, then this is pretty bad because people's incomes get squeezed, and this could lead to some political risk. An upcoming election could change, for example, policy, and as such businesses could face uncertainty, consumers could face uncertainty over which political party is going to be elected into power and what policies they'll pursue, and that could be 1 or 2 years out, and that's in line with the electoral cycle. Similarly, rising unemployment. If you have a lot of rising unemployment and a spike in inflation at the same time, as we saw in the Middle East in 2012, 2013, then it could lead to protests and demonstrations in the street, which could overthrow a government, or it could cause investment to fall, for example. Similarly, if you have a government in power, which is part of a coalition, and the coalition is very weak, you could have policy deadlock, and because there's very little policy or policy reforms, or very few new policies enacted by Parliament or Congress, this could mean that the economic development and economic growth is not forthcoming, and as such that could lead to short-term political risk because the government could fall eventually as there's a maybe vote of no confidence, or as they call snap elections in order to figure out the stalemate. There also could be a foreign or domestic threat, so a military threat domestically could lead to political and economic uncertainty. So let's say war or civil war in a neighboring country which sees a lot of rebel forces on the border, or lots of refugees coming into your economy because they're running away from the other country, as happened in Syria, for example. Then you could see domestic or foreign military threats impact on your short-term risk. And this will impact on your short-term economic outlook as well. In terms of longer-term risks, they're quite similar to short-term risks. However, you want to interpret them from a more structural perspective, in the sense that they can affect long-term political and economic outcomes. They typically take longer to change, and they're really embedded in the kind of structure of the economy or political system. So a good example is weak institutions, and that could be a weak judiciary or a lack of enforcement in laws, or they can be manipulated. And this means that it's not a short-term risk, it's actually a long-term enduring risk, which is bad for the business environment. You could also see high levels of corruption, and because there's a lot of corruption, there's a lack of transparency and accountability, and this will mean that there's a lot of uncertainty with regard to legal process and business environment. Again, these are structural in nature, which don't really fluctuate depending which party's in power. It's usually embedded in the structure. Could also have an unequal distribution of income and opportunity. In this regard, if you have high or rising income inequality, you could see social pressures and unrest. However, typically this takes a lot of time to manifest itself. Typically, something economic has to happen for them to reach a tipping point. One case could be very unequal incomes, and the poor people, which could be the majority of the population, sees a huge rise in living standards. They can no longer afford their living standards because of high inflation, high unemployment, and that could see a tipping point. So this is more of a structural issue, which combined with a short-term political risk such as high inflation and high unemployment could cause a big change in political outcomes. Similarly, the stability or structure of government, in the sense that it could be very stable or unstable government which continuously falls, then it leads to long-term political risk as there's a lack of policy formation and bad for the business environment, or if there's only a one-party system relative to a multi-party system where there's opposition and it's healthy competition for the presidency. This could all have long-term implications in terms of political and economic risk. And I would say another one which is important is respect for international law. I think if you don't have respect for international law, such as trade agreements or border disputes, then you could have ongoing political risk with your neighbors, or particularly trade associations or international organizations such as the IMF, the World Bank, etc. And so if you do have respect for international law, typically will lower the risk from an international perspective. So short and long-term risk are very similar in the sense that they measure risk. However, what's different is how you want to interpret them. So short-term risks, I would say, are those which can affect the risk profile of the country in the next few days or weeks or months or years. And one event can trigger them because there's pressures building from a structural perspective. The long-term risks are those which maybe won't affect the risk profile immediately, but they're underlying risks which are building up. And once they do get triggered, then they could cause significant changes, such as a move from a one-party state to multi-party states, or rising inequality to a very left-wing government which tries to redistribute the wealth of the economy. And these types of risks typically look at the structure of the political system and they're longer term in nature. So that's an overview of the difference between short and long-term risks and how you can categorize them over a time frame, and not only as a macro risk which affects the whole country or a micro risk which can affect a particular industry, but it's really through an intertemporal lens.